The first thing he noticed was the color of the smoke. It was not the thin gray thread that rose from a galley fire, or the pale ghost of a signal flare, but a thick, rolling black that boiled up from the horizon like a storm cloud forcing its way out of the sea. Lieutenant Jack Merritt, strapped into the cramped cockpit of his SBD Dauntless, felt the vibration of the engine in his chest as he banked slightly, the nose pointed down toward the Japanese carrier below. For a fleeting second, before the bombing run took over his whole mind, he realized what he was looking at. A proud ship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, suddenly reduced to a burning, staggering animal under the sky. Somewhere far away, in a quiet room in Tokyo, someone had once traced the word Midway on a map and laughed at how small it looked. Out here, over the Pacific in June 1942, nobody was laughing anymore. Below Jack, the deck of the carrier was chaos. Aircraft lay scattered like broken toys, some half-fueled, some armed, some just shoved aside in the frantic rush to change from one mission to another. Yellow-jerseyed deck crews were specks of panic dashing across planks that shimmered in the heat. The white wakes of escorting destroyers crisscrossed behind the carrier as they turned desperately, guns elevated, dark puffs of anti-aircraft fire sprouting around the incoming American dive bombers. The radio in Jack's ear was a jumble of call signs, coordinates, and one repeated phrase, half disbelieving and half exultant. "We've caught them! We've actually caught them!" He pulled back gently on the stick, felt the nose rise for a moment, then rolled over into his dive. The world upended. The horizon swung like a door. His stomach lurched, and the Dauntless pointed straight down at the carrier's midsection. Wind screamed past the canopy. The altimeter numbers spun upward as the ocean rushed at him. A hard blue sheet broken only by that one vulnerable rectangle of Japanese steel. In that vertiginous tunnel of air and adrenaline, the months of fear and humiliation, Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the march across the Philippines, compressed into a single point. This was the moment when a tiny, mocked atoll called Midway reached out its invisible hand and grabbed 4 mighty carriers by the throat. Hours earlier, before the sky turned into a killing ground, Midway itself had seemed impossibly small. From the air, it was just a smudge of land in a limitless, indifferent ocean, fringed by white surf and patched with dark green scrub. On the ground, Marines and Navy personnel moved between sandbagged positions, gun emplacements, and dugouts carved hurriedly into coral. The air smelled of hot dust, cordite, and fuel. Seabirds shrieked overhead, wheeling in offended circles as if the war were an intrusion into their ancient routines. Men wiped sweat from their faces, adjusted helmets, and glanced up too often at the empty sky, knowing that somewhere out beyond the horizon, ships were coming that most of them would never see. Months earlier, those ships had been lines on a chart in a wood-paneled room thousands of miles away. The electric lamps buzzed softly over the long table as admirals and staff officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy bent over maps of the Pacific. The war had begun barely half a year before, but in that time, the crimson imperial flag seemed to have spread like a rash across the oceans. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, battleships gutted in their own harbor. Hong Kong had fallen. The Philippines, after a stubborn resistance, were crumbling. The British had been driven from Malaya and Singapore. It was a run of victories so dazzling that even senior officers began to believe the war was unfolding according to some inevitable destiny. One of them tapped the map with the back of a pencil, the wood clicking on the tiny ring of ink that marked Midway. "A mere speck," he said, his voice carrying just enough contempt to draw a thin smile from a colleague across the table. The atoll, lying roughly halfway between Asia and North America, looked ridiculously small compared to the arc of Japanese conquest. In Tokyo's grand design, Midway was a detail, a stepping stone on the way to breaking American power in the Pacific. The High Command's plan, labeled Operation MI, was to crush the tiny outpost, lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, and destroy them in a decisive naval battle that would force Washington to negotiate from a position of weakness. At the center of that plan stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He knew better than most how dangerous the Americans could be. He had studied in the United States, knew their industrial capacity, their stubbornness, yet even Yamamoto, cautious by nature, now found himself riding a wave of institutional overconfidence. Pearl Harbor's success had been breathtaking. Japanese air and naval forces had swept aside colonial powers that had seemed immovable just months before. Staff officers leafed through after-action reports filled with phrases like complete surprise, overwhelming success, enemy resistance negligible. It was a dangerous diet for any institution, a constant drip of evidence that seemed to confirm their own superiority. So when Midway came under discussion, it was framed from the beginning as a small problem. The atoll did not have the grandeur of Hawaii, the strategic prestige of the Philippines, or the psychological weight of striking at Australia. Midway was, in the dismissive language of some planners, a tiny outpost, useful mainly as bait. The logic was simple: seize Midway, fortify it, and use it as a staging ground to threaten Hawaii and eventually the American West Coast. To take Midway, the Japanese would bring the most potent weapon they had, their fast carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, the same force that had humbled Pearl Harbor. The Kido Butai was more than a collection of ships. It was a culture, almost a myth. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had become floating symbols of Japanese naval power, their flight decks launching waves of aircraft with a precision that impressed even their enemies. Pilots who had trained for years in demanding, sometimes brutal programs, now wore the aura of invincibility. On the mess decks and in the smoking rooms, there was talk of how American pilots were slower, less disciplined, more clumsy in the air. "They rely on machines," one aviator told his friend with a shrug. "We rely on spirit." It was the kind of remark that made sense only to those already convinced of their own superiority. On the other side of the ocean, in a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, men in rumpled shirts and loosened ties hunched over radio transcripts and stacks of thin paper. The air was stale with cigarette smoke and the bitter smell of too much coffee. Fans turned lazily overhead, pushing heat from one corner of the room to another without much effect. Here, in what was known as Station Hypo, the war looked nothing like parades or carrier decks. It looked like strings of numbers and letters, fragments of intercepted Japanese communications that had been broken, partially deciphered, and spread out like puzzle pieces on long tables. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the eccentric, intense head of Hypo, moved among his people with a deliberate restlessness, pausing to peer over shoulders, then drifting away again. His shoes were often scuffed, his uniform sometimes less than pristine, but his mind was razor sharp. For months, his team had been picking at the Japanese naval code JN-25, breaking bits of it, exploiting careless repetitions, building a map of Japanese intentions from jargon and routine traffic. Now a new flurry of signals hinted at something bigger, a major operation that would take place against a target coded only as AF. The battle for Midway began, in a sense, as a debate about those two letters. Some in Washington and Pearl Harbor thought AF might be Hawaii, or some other Central Pacific base. Rochefort was convinced it was Midway. He had seen patterns in supply messages, weather requests, and routine reports that all pointed to the tiny atoll. But to decisively convince skeptical superiors, he needed more than intuition. So Hypo devised a trick. They had Midway send out an uncoded radio message, a deliberate break in procedure, stating that the island's fresh water system had failed and that they were short on water. Then, the codebreakers waited. Soon, intercepted Japanese traffic reported that AF is short of water. It was the turning point in a quiet war of wits almost as deadly as any exchange of gunfire. In a single line of enemy text, Rochefort's hunch was confirmed. The Japanese were coming for Midway. The tiny outpost that Tokyo treated like an afterthought now became, in American eyes, the focal point of a desperate gamble. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was not a gambler by temperament, but he understood odds. He looked at Rochefort's decrypted messages, at the estimated composition of Japanese forces: 4 heavy carriers, battleships, cruisers, a vast screen of destroyers, and then at his own ragged rebuilding navy. After Pearl Harbor, the American battleship line had been gutted. What remained of Pacific striking power lay mostly in 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered but still functioning Yorktown. On paper, it was not a fair fight. If Tokyo saw Midway as tiny, some in Washington saw the remaining U.S. carrier force as fragile, a thin thread on which the fate of the Pacific hung. Yet, intelligence offered a strange kind of leverage. For the first time since the war began, the Americans knew roughly when and where the enemy would strike. Nimitz understood that advantage as a rare, fleeting thing. If he pulled back out of caution, he might preserve his carriers a little longer, but he would hand the Japanese an uncontested victory and allow them to move closer to Hawaii. If he pushed them forward, he risked everything on one battle. He chose to push. In staff meetings and briefings, the plan slowly took shape. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would move into a position northeast of Midway, waiting unseen for the Japanese approach. Midway itself would be reinforced with every available aircraft: obsolete but still dangerous torpedo bombers, marine fighters, army bombers pressed into naval service. The garrison would stand as both shield and bait, absorbing the first blows and forcing the Japanese Japanese to reveal themselves. The ocean would provide the rest of the concealment. In maps and briefings, the carriers' movements were lines of ink. In reality, they were tiny dots of steel moving through a vast blue wilderness, hoping to be at the right place at the right time. On Midway, the soldiers and airmen did not see the cryptanalytic games or the admiral's calculations. They saw bulldozers gouging new revetments into coral, ammunition crates stacked under camouflage netting, and new aircraft crowding an airfield that felt suddenly too small. They heard the steady thump of hammers as men shored up defensive positions and strung more wire. Nights were short, lit by cigarettes cupped in hands and quiet conversations about home that sometimes trailed off into silence. Marines joked darkly that the brass had finally remembered they existed. The island, which had always felt remote, now felt like the center of the world. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the Japanese fleet was assembling according to a plan that was intricate to the point of fragility. Yamamoto's strategy divided his forces into multiple groups. The carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the invasion force that would occupy Midway, and a distant main battle fleet that Yamamoto himself would command. On a chart, it looked impressive, a series of converging arrows that would surround and crush any American counterattack. But the complexity masked a fundamental weakness. Those forces were spread out over hundreds of miles, often beyond mutual support, linked by radio signals that Japanese doctrine insisted should be kept to a minimum to preserve surprise. Within the Kido Butai, Nagumo's pilots and deck crews prepared with the smooth confidence of veterans. Aircraft were checked and rechecked, bombs hoisted, fuel lines connected. Briefings were held in cramped ready rooms where the air stank of sweat, tobacco, and aviation fuel. Maps of Midway were pinned to bulkheads, arrows drawn to indicate runways, defensive positions, likely AA batteries. Many of the air crews had flown over Pearl Harbor. They had seen American ships burning and thought of that day as a kind of proof that their training and their navy were unmatched. "What do they have left?" a young pilot asked his squadron leader as they studied the map. 2, maybe 3 carriers? Scraps of a fleet? Scraps, the older man replied, tapping the island with a finger. "This place is nothing. We hit them hard, sweep away whatever comes, and then Hawaii will be in reach. They cannot stop us." The idea that the Americans might know what was coming, that they might already be moving carriers to intercept them, never quite took hold in these conversations. The Japanese overestimated their own operational security and underestimated their opponent's ability to read and respond. To them, the Americans were still scrambling, reactive, guided by guesswork. The ocean, they believed, would conceal their movements as it always had. The first contact between those two worlds came not as a clash of fleets, but as brief, tense encounters between scout planes and ships. The Pacific, calm under a wide blue sky in early June 1942, held both predator and prey without announcing which was which. Japanese reconnaissance was hampered by doctrine and decisions. Not enough long-range search planes were sent out, and some sectors were left dangerously uncovered. American PBY flying boats and Midway-based patrol aircraft, by contrast, crisscrossed the sea, their crews peering through binoculars at empty horizons until their eyes ached. In the pre-dawn hours of June 4th, Midway's radar operators and observers reported incoming aircraft. Sirens wailed across the atoll, their rising moan cutting through the humid air. Men tumbled from bunks, boots half-laced, grabbing helmets and weapons as they ran to their stations. Anti-aircraft crews swung guns toward the bearing of the approaching formation. Pilots scrambled toward their planes, engines roared to life, and the once quiet island erupted into a frenzy of movement. The Japanese strike force approached in disciplined waves, bombers and fighters in formation against the growing light of morning. From the cockpits, Midway's airfield and facilities came into view, small but clearly marked. Runways, fuel tanks, hangars. To the Japanese pilots, it looked exactly like what they had been told it was. A small outpost whose defenses could be neutralized with a single, well-executed attack. Bomb bay doors opened. Dive brakes deployed. The sky above Midway filled with the menace of descending aircraft. On the ground, the attack felt like the end of the world. Bombs whistled and then slammed into coral and concrete, throwing up fountains of dust and debris. Shockwaves punched through bunkers, rattling teeth and making the earth feel like a drumskin under a giant's hand. Fuel tanks erupted in greasy flames, sending pillars of black smoke clawing into the sky. Men shouted orders and curses, their voices half lost beneath the rolling thunder of explosions. Anti-aircraft guns hammered back, tracers stitching glowing lines into the air. Some Japanese planes went down, smoking arcs that ended in the sea or on the reef, but enough survived to leave the island looking scarred and burning. In the Japanese strike leader's report back to Nagumo, the damage was assessed as significant, but not decisive. The airfield was damaged, yes, but not completely knocked out. Facilities were still usable. Much of the island's defensive power remained. The pilots recommended a second strike to finish the job. This message, when it reached Nagumo, collided with another piece of information. A scout plane's delayed but ominous sighting of enemy ships, possibly carriers, somewhere to the northeast. It was at this moment that the arrogance embedded in the entire operation crystallized into a single, deadly dilemma. Nagumo had to choose. He could immediately rearm his reserve aircraft on the carriers with anti-ship weapons and launch them at the newly sighted American forces, hoping to strike before they struck him. Or he could prepare a second wave against Midway to guarantee the island's neutralization, rearming his planes from land attack ordnance to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and only then turn to the carriers. Japanese doctrine, steeped in the idea of the decisive battle, emphasized concentration and thoroughness. Midway, seen as an easy target, was also seen as something that had to be tidied up properly. Nagumo chose a compromise that turned out to be the worst of both worlds. He delayed, ordering his crews to switch armaments, then rethinking, then trying to keep options open. The carriers' hangars and decks became crowded, dangerous spaces loaded with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses as crews rushed to change loads under the pressure of conflicting orders. Aircraft sat half-prepared, lined up for strikes that would be retasked, modified, or delayed again. Beneath their feet, the magazines throbbed with latent energy, bomb after bomb waiting for a spark. While this confusion reigned below decks, the Americans groped their way toward the Japanese with imperfect information and incredible courage. From Midway itself, waves of aircraft were launched against the approaching Japanese carriers. Many of these were older types, slow torpedo bombers and outclassed fighters. Pilots knew, as they took off, that their odds of survival were slim. They flew anyway, engines straining as they lifted from the short island runway and turned out over the glittering sea. The attacks that followed were brave, but largely tragic. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying the nimble and deadly Zero fighters, intercepted Midway's planes well short of their targets. Torpedo bombers were chopped apart by cannon fire, engines trailing smoke, wings snapping as they spiraled into the ocean. The sea below became dotted with floating debris and tiny struggling figures in life vests. In cockpits and gun positions, American crews watched their comrades die and kept flying straight into the hail of fire, knowing that anything but a straight, steady approach would make their torpedoes even less likely to hit. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots defending the fleet, the picture seemed to confirm everything they had believed about their own superiority. Clumsy enemy planes approached at low altitude and slow speed, presenting fat targets. One after another they were shot down. "They are throwing themselves at us," one pilot would later recall, still almost incredulous. It was like watching moths burn in a flame. What the Japanese did not see clearly, in that moment of apparent dominance, was that this slaughter had a cost they could not afford. To intercept and destroy the low-flying torpedo planes, the Zeros had to drop to their level, leaving the high altitudes above the fleet temporarily underguarded. They burned fuel, spent ammunition, and ended up scattered across the sky at the very moment when discipline and altitude would soon matter most. And while those slow torpedo bombers died in droves, they forced Nagumo's ships to maneuver violently, turning into torpedo tracks, disrupting formations, and keeping decks and crews under constant strain. The Japanese officers on the bridge may have mocked the inadequacy of these attacks, but they could not ignore them. Far above, nearly forgotten in the chaos, American dive bombers were still seeking their prey. Spruance and Fletcher had launched their carrier planes as soon as they could, sending them searching over a wide area based on best guess positions. Many did not find the enemy at all. Some found them but arrived piecemeal, attacking without coordination. Flight leaders wrestled with incomplete information, drifting clouds, and the consuming fear of running low on fuel before ever seeing a target. Groups became separated. Radios crackled. For some time, it seemed possible that the intelligence advantage that had brought them this far might be squandered by the sheer difficulty of finding moving ships in a vast ocean. Lieutenant Jack Merritt's group from Enterprise had flown through that uncertainty, watching their fuel gauges drop. They had seen empty ocean, then distant specks that turned out to be nothing, then finally the faint outlines of wakes. When the Japanese carriers emerged in full view, sunlight glinting off their wakes and flight decks, the mixture of relief and dread was almost paralyzing. The carriers were not sitting still. They were turning hard, wake patterns overlapping, anti-aircraft guns already beginning to track the newcomers. Dark smudges of smoke showed where bombs and torpedoes had hit or near missed recently. The scene was chaotic and vulnerable. As Jack rolled into his dive, he glimpsed the state of the carrier beneath him. Aircraft jammed the deck, some suspiciously arranged like planes being prepared for takeoff, others pushed aside in haste. Weapons carts were scattered about. Fuel hoses lay like snakes across planking now blackened in places by earlier attacks. He could not see the internal compartments where bombs and torpedoes sat ready in magazines, nor the hangar decks crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed, but he could feel, at an instinctive level, that this was a moment when the enemy was not as ready as they looked. The Dauntless screamed downward. Airframe vibrations shook his bones. Jack's hand rested on the release, his eyes fixed on the point just ahead of the carrier's island where he intended his bomb to fall. Anti-aircraft bursts popped around him, black flowers suddenly opening in the air and leaving jagged fragments spinning through invisible arcs. He heard, distantly, someone on the radio shout that they had hit another carrier, that she was burning badly. Then he was at release altitude, muscles moving through practiced motions, the bomb dropping away, the Dauntless lurching slightly as its load vanished. He pulled back, hard, feeling crushing G-force as the dive broke into a climb. For a moment his vision narrowed, edges darkening, then returned as the aircraft leveled out. He looked over his shoulder just in time to see the bomb strike. It hit near the carrier's midsection, punching through the flight deck and disappearing inside. There was a pause, a half-second of eerie stillness, and then a blossoming explosion that vented fire and debris through the deck, sending shards of metal spinning into the air. Secondary explosions followed, smaller flashes chasing each other along the length of the ship as fuel tanks ignited and stored bombs cooked off. Elsewhere over the formation, other dive bombers were doing the same to other carriers. In the space of roughly 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were fatally hit: Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Their crews fought desperately to contain the damage, but the distribution of fuel and ordnance, the flammable materials of aircraft and wooden deck surfaces, turned each ship into a chain of disasters linked by heat and shock. Fire roared through hangars, feeding on canvas, fuel, and human panic. Men sprinted through smoke-choked corridors, some carrying hoses that spewed thin streams of water into furnaces, others dragging wounded shipmates toward ladders that led up into a sky that now rained debris. On the bridges of those carriers, officers who had spoken casually of Midway's insignificance now stared at an enemy they had never fully imagined, their own assumptions exploding in their faces. They had believed that American aviators were inferior, that their own air defenses were tight, that their ships were well protected. Instead, 3 of their finest carriers now staggered, bleeding fire and smoke. Messages flew between ships and up the chain of command, but for many aboard, the battle had already shifted from attacking Midway to simply trying not to die. One carrier remained operational, Hiryu. Under her captain and air group commander, she launched counter-strikes against the American carriers that had just shattered the fleet. In 2 sharp attacks, Japanese planes found and hit Yorktown, hammering the already damaged vessel with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier, which had been patched together in a miracle of rushed repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea, now shuddered under new wounds. Fires broke out, compartments flooded, crews worked in choking smoke to keep her alive long enough for her planes to land and refuel on other decks. From Hiryu's perspective, for a few hours, the fight still seemed winnable. Their pilots returned with news of an American carrier burning, possibly sinking. Adrenaline surged through the remaining Japanese crews. Maybe, they thought, they could still salvage the day, maybe even inflict a defeat that would offset the earlier losses. The idea that 3 carriers might somehow be traded for one, or that American industrial might would eventually replace their losses far faster than Japan could, was pushed aside. In battle, men cling to the immediate balance sheet. What did we hit? What did we lose? What can we still strike? But Hiryu's reprieve was temporary. American reconnaissance found her, alone now in a suddenly larger ocean, and another wave of dive bombers was sent. The attack that followed felt, in some ways, like an echo of the strikes that had destroyed her sisters. Dive bombers appeared high overhead, descending in steep, shrieking dives, as anti-aircraft guns tried frantically to catch them in patterns of shrapnel. This time it was Hiryu's turn to take the hits, her decks erupting as bombs tore into her structure and set off fires that roared down into her heart. By the time the smoke began to drift and the last echoes of explosions rolled away, all 4 carriers that had led the attack on Midway were mortally wounded. On the surface of the sea, the scale of the disaster slowly revealed itself. Great plumes of smoke stood like pillars against the sky, marking the positions of dying ships. Men clung to floating wreckage, oil-slicked and dazed. Lifeboats bobbed amidst a confetti of debris, pieces of deck planking, shattered aircraft, battered life rafts. Rescue operations began even as some of the crippled carriers were abandoned. abandoned. Sailors who had spent their careers training for the decisive battle now found themselves staring at the upturned hulls of the very ships that had been meant to deliver it. On one Japanese destroyer, an officer looked back at the burning remains of a carrier and remembered with something like nausea a staff briefing in Tokyo. He had been younger then, more eager, and he had laughed, along with others, when Midway had been described as just a speck, an outpost, they had called it, a stepping stone. Now, as oil burned on the water and over 100 aircraft lay smashed on the seabed, that speck loomed in his mind like a shadow, not because Midway itself possessed any great inherent power, but because the decision to underestimate it had led them here. On the American side, news of the victory spread unevenly and in fragments. On Midway, men emerged from foxholes and bunkers to see the smoke on the horizon, unsure at first whose ships were burning. Messages from the carriers reached Nimitz's headquarters in bursts. Enemy carriers hit, multiple burning, one escaping. Now all four confirmed lost. In Pearl Harbor, where oil still stained the harbor from the December attack, officers and enlisted men alike felt something shift in their chests, an almost physical easing of a weight they had carried since that Sunday morning. The Japanese could be beaten, not in small skirmishes, not by accidents, but in the kind of major fleet engagement they themselves had sought. The battle did not end instantly with the sinking of the carriers. Japanese cruisers and destroyers still prowled the seas, and the remnants of their air groups still posed a threat. Yorktown, though evacuated, stubbornly refused to sink, her bones refusing to release their grip on buoyancy. Days later, she would be sent finally to the bottom by a submarine torpedo. American and Japanese search and rescue efforts pulled men from the water, friends and enemies alike tasting the same oily brine. Yet the essential shape of the conflict had changed. 4 heavy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone, along with many of Japan's best pilots and deck crews. In Tokyo, the news arrived first in softened form, then with harsher clarity. The official communique tried to frame the battle as a tactical setback, a complicated engagement whose details were still being studied. Within the high command, behind closed doors, faces hardened as the full magnitude sank in. The carrier force that had spearheaded Japan's maritime advance was gutted. Replacing ships would take years. Replacing experienced pilots and deck crews would prove nearly impossible. Japan's industrial base, stretched already to sustain operations across a vast empire, could not match the United States in a race of attrition. The war had not been lost at Midway, but its trajectory had been bent in a way that could not easily be unbent. For Admiral Yamamoto, who had famously warned before the war that he could run wild for 6 months, but could promise nothing after that, Midway appeared almost like the fulfillment of his own prophecy. The 6 months of unbroken triumphs, from December 1941 to early June 1942, had created an illusion of inevitability. Midway shattered that illusion. The decisive battle he had sought had occurred, but it had not gone according to plan. The enemy, far from being paralyzed, had anticipated his moves, sprung a trap, and emerged stronger relative to him than before. On the decks of American ships returning from the battle, the mood was both jubilant and somber. Pilots who had survived the dives and the flak leaned back in their ready room chairs and listened as comrades recounted near misses and sudden deaths. Photos were passed around, grainy images of carriers burning or explosions blooming on decks, each one a confirmation of something still hard to believe. Yet the lists of the missing and killed were long. Torpedo squadrons had been practically wiped out. Many of the men whose bravery had pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level, clearing the way for the dive bombers, would never see home. Jack Merritt stood at the rail of his carrier one evening as the ship cut through rolling swells, the sky streaked with the dying light of another Pacific sunset. He thought of the moment his bomb struck, of the carrier's deck splitting open in flame, of the figures running desperately along its length. He wondered about the young pilots on that ship, men like himself who had climbed into cockpits believing their cause was just and their nation invincible. He had no illusions about the necessity of what he had done. Those ships had to be destroyed, or they would have killed more Americans and more allies. But somewhere beneath the satisfaction of a hard-won victory, a quieter, more complicated feeling lurked, an understanding that wars were decided in part by the beliefs men held about themselves and their enemies. Midway would enter history books as a turning point, a battle where the numerical superiority of one side was undercut by its own overconfidence and by the agility of its opponent. Analysts would write about the role of intelligence, praising Rochefort and his team. They would analyze Nagumo's fateful hesitation, the doctrinal biases that led Japanese planners to underestimate the importance of flexible scouting and rapid decision-making. They would marvel at the courage of the pilots who flew into almost certain death and debate the fairness or foolishness of sending obsolete aircraft against modern fleets. But beneath all those layers of professional analysis, the story remained, at its core, a cautionary tale about contempt. Tokyo had looked at Midway and seen a tiny target, a speck on the map that could be swept aside on the way to greater objectives. That contempt had seeped into planning, into the dispersal of forces, into the assumption that the enemy would not, or could not respond intelligently. It had shaped the way the Japanese officers thought about the Americans, and about the proper sequence of tasks on that critical June morning. It had made a small island seem like an afterthought, rather than a potential fulcrum. On Midway itself, months after the battle, burned-out fuel tanks and twisted wreckage still marked the places where bombs had fallen. The smell of char had faded, washed out by rain and wind, but the scars remained, etched into coral and concrete. New aircraft occupied repaired revetments. New men walked the same ground, some of them barely aware of how close the island had come to falling. The ocean crashed relentlessly on the reefs, as it always had, indifferent to human schemes. Seabirds nested again where they had scattered in panic during the attack. If you stood there at dawn and looked toward the northeast, where the carriers had once approached in arrogant confidence, you would see only open water. The four great hulls that had sliced through those swells were gone, resting in darkness far below. The officers who had joked about Midway's insignificance were either dead or carrying the memory of the battle with them into a future that would hold more retreats than advances. The American carriers that had lurked in ambush would go on to fight at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and beyond, part of an ascendant tide that would eventually reach all the way to Japan's home islands. In the end, Midway was both small and vast. On a map, it remained what it had always been, a tiny ring of coral and sand, scarcely able to hold an airfield and a few facilities. In the history of the war, it became something much larger, the hinge on which the Pacific theater swung from one direction to another. It proved that intelligence could offset numerical disadvantage, that courage could exploit opportunities created by quiet men in windowless rooms decoding enemy messages, and that arrogance could turn even the most formidable armada into a brittle thing. For the sailors and airmen who fought there, however, Midway was not a symbol, but a memory of noise, heat, fear, and resolve. It was the scream of engines in a dive and the roar of flak. It was the thud of boots on steel decks suddenly tilting underfoot. It was the taste of salt and smoke in the back of the throat. It was the shock of seeing a supposedly invincible enemy burning, and the realization that nothing in war was truly inevitable. Tokyo had mocked tiny Midway. The laughter had echoed in comfortable rooms over polished tables. On June 4th, 1942, that laughter was drowned out by the sound of bombs falling and ships dying. 4 carriers vanished in smoke, and with them vanished the illusion that size on a map was the same as importance, that contempt for the small could go unpunished. The Pacific would remember, so would the world.